Welcome to another installment of Monday Q&A. I hope you've all had a fantastic weekend. To everybody who submitted a question for this week's video, thank you very much. I'm going to try to get to as many of those as I can. If you've got a question you would like me to answer on next week's video, simply pop it in the comments section below. And if you like and appreciate what I'm doing here on my channel, you can check out the video description for a variety of different ways to support what I do. Let's go. First question comes from friends of the channel, Kale and Neil. Am I going to go and see Living Colour and Extreme when they come to Perth? 100% as soon as that gig got announced. My group chats were lighting up where a couple of mates were saying, can you believe that they're coming together? I have been lucky enough to support Living Colour with Ragdoll the last time they were here, but I missed Extreme when they were here. They did a co-headliner with Mr. Big and I was away, and I was kind of devastated that I didn't get to see that show. I have seen Extreme before at a festival in the US. They were pretty amazing. The new album or the tracks they've released so far sounds pretty slamming. So I'm very, very excited about that. It's like two of the funkiest, tightest hard rock bands of all time playing together. I can't wait. Speaking of things that got announced recently, the Zelda Tears of the Kingdom final trailer made me feel things and made me very, very excited. That's a game that, as soon as they announced that they were working on a new Zelda title, I got super excited about because, that's something that has not only been a nostalgic thing for me growing up with those games. I have played hundreds of hours of Breath of the Wild sitting around here, playing it on planes. Anytime I had the chance to take my Switch on tour, I just play that game, and it was a great way to deal with the hurry up and wait situations that you inevitably find yourself in on tour. But yeah, very, very excited about that. Really curious to see what the kind of overall storyline is going to be. I'm curious to see if they incorporate things like dungeons this time around, or if it's going to be another just kind of fully open world style situation like Breath of the Wild. And, kind of curious to see, are we going to get just a Ganondorf kind of villain, or is that demise that we see in the trailer? For any of the Zelda fans out there, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and what are your predictions for that game, because it comes out in under a month. And yeah, I don't think I'm going to get much work done in May. I'm probably going to play that game a lot. Next question comes from friend of the channel, GT, saying, if you're not subscribed to GT's channel, go and check it out. There's some fantastic stuff on there. Fantastic player and presenter as well. My thoughts on pointy versus round picks, especially for fast playing. Well, this is the pick that I have in my hands at the moment. If I can get this to focus, there you go. It's a what is this? Is this an Ultex or a Tortex? It's a Tortex Jazz 3, 1.35 millimeters. I like them when they come out fresh and they are super sharp, but I think inevitably you kind of knock these little smooth edges onto them. You can kind of see that. And I quite like it as long as it doesn't get too round and blunt. I feel like there's a nice trade-off between the overall initial attack and what some people might call chirp on there. I like a little bit of chirp, especially if you're playing hard rock and metal guitar, but too much of it can be super distracting. So I found in the past when I'm tracking heavy rhythm guitars, I actually use one of those green Tortexes, the 1 millimeters, the big ones. They just kind of have the tone over something like this. For playing lead guitar, I like this, and for playing live, I really like this because I drop it less than any other pick, which is it's important if you're going to have a pick. The pick that you're actually able to hold on to is more important than the one that you drop. So it's one of those things. I've tried pretty much every type of pick material out there, whether it be bone, handcrafted stuff, or metal, or, things that are various plastics and, tortoiseshell. And I guess Tortex is designed to be kind of like a synthetic version of tortoiseshell. So yeah, I just really like these picks. I've tried all the other Jazz 3s, and that just seems to be the shape that works really nicely for me. But I'm actually probably slightly less fussy these days. I just bought 1,000 of these, so I'm probably good for a little while. I hinted at some new Ragdoll music coming out soon. This question is about mixing and mastering our music. Do we mix and master our own tunes? We don't. All the recording, production, and mixing is handled by ultimate friend of the channel and co-host of The Gear Podcast. You should go and check out The Gear Podcast. It's something that I do with my good friend Troy Navaban, who is a fantastic producer, mix engineer. Troy can probably play guitar and bass and sing better than most people that I know. So it's an absolute pleasure having them on board. And then for mastering, Back to Zero was mastered by Paul Logus over in the US. And I really like Paul's stuff and will probably use Paul again in the future. He mastered both of our more recent singles, Rust and Follow the Leader. And Paul just kind of gets it. And when you look at Paul's list of credits, it's pretty impressive. The DGT SE, have I had a chance to have a rip on one? You're all aware of my love and admiration for the core DGT. I borrowed one recently and it still haunts my dreams. And, you know, Ray, if you're watching this, sell me your DGT. It was such a great guitar. I think about that thing all the time. I had a chance at the Melbourne Guitar Show to just have a noodle around on one unplugged for maybe 2 minutes while I was kind of not really paying attention. So I can't really say that I've tried one, but it felt like a DGT and it looked like a DGT. Sort of all the videos that I've seen of people comparing them, talking about how, you know, it's probably the best SE guitar PRS have ever made. Just from the little details on there that I was able to have a look at, I can certainly believe that. So hopefully I'll be able to get my hands on one in the not too distant future and do a video with one and actually kind of do a demo and review. That 2 minutes that I had noodling on one definitely left a pretty nice little impression. The middle position on a twin humbucker guitar like a Les Paul, it has to be one of the most underrated tones out there. On my Sunburst Les Paul, which you can't quite see, it's just sitting just out of shot over there, I've actually got a pair of Martin A. Smith humbuckers in there, and the magnets are out of phase with one another. So when you use it in the middle position, you kind of get this Telecaster-like tone. You know, it's the Peter Green mod, as Martin called it on there. And, you know, he said it was definitely intentional on there, so I'm going to believe him. But that's something that I really like. You know, if you flip the magnet around, that's a tone. It sort of sounds like a strange Telecaster, and if you boost it up with a drive pedal or a compressor, I don't think many people would realize that you've got a Les Paul. When the magnets are in phase, you know, on a Les Paul where you've got a volume and tone control per pickup, then you can kind of blend those in. It's almost like a jazz bass situation in there where you can get all these lovely shades of the tones you already like. So one thing that, you know, I kind of like doing on a Les Paul with that setup is if you have your bridge pickup wide open for your rock and roll tone, and then you have your neck pickup and you back the volume and the tone off just a little bit, so it's a little bit cleaner, a little bit darker and sweeter, then you move to that middle position. I find that can be a really good way to get 3 distinct sounds out of the guitar, because you have your kind of full-on bridge pickup tone, and then your middle position like blends in just a little bit of that kind of warmer, darker tone in there, and then you've got a much cleaner, darker thing on the neck pickup. If you've never tried that on your Les Paul style guitar, I would definitely recommend it. And if you'd like to see a standalone video about that, let me know in the comments. Have I checked out the guitar player Misha Calvin? Not aware of them until now, and I have just been listening to their album Evolution. Tony Martin on vocals, who is one of my favorite singers of all time. If you're not aware of Tony Martin, Tony is probably best known for his work with Black Sabbath, in particular the albums Headless Cross and TYR or Tear. I'm not sure how you're meant to pronounce that, but the track Anno Mundi is one of my favorite heavy songs ever. One of my favorite Sabbath tunes as well. Tony Martin to me is kind of like Dio with a slightly bigger extended range on there. So if you like Dio and you think Dio is amazing, you got to check out Tony Martin, one of my favorite singers in the heavy metal hard rock genre. And I was really enjoying what I heard of Misha Calvin's Evolution album, and turns out I think Misha is Serbian as well, so people who know me know that my dad was born in Yugoslavia. There's some Serbian ancestry in there, so you know, I'm going to listen to all of this and just be a little bit reminiscent about old country that I've never really visited because I was born in Australia and I'm Australian. But anyway, I think that's kind of a cool little tie-in. Maybe we're related somewhere because we definitely like the same greasy tones. Thanks for the recommendation. My thoughts on the Motley Crue versus Mick Mars saga. I mentioned when Mick basically retired, or it was announced that Mick was retiring, my thoughts on Mick Mars in a previous Q&A video. And, you know, I think Mick's pretty underrated, and Mick has one of the best fat, crunchy, colossal tones from that era. You know, Dr. Feelgood is such a great sounding album. You know you're doing something right when that tone is used to reference things on other Bob Rock productions, like the Black Album, probably the most influential metal album ever. So yeah, I think Mick is kind of underrated as a, songwriter and riff writer and a tone merchant. There's that story in The Dirt where Mick said that Jeff Beck was listening to some of Mick's playing and thought it was two guitar players, and Mick, being a massive Jeff Beck fan, was kind of blown away by all of that. So yeah, I kind of dig Mick's tone. It's a bit of a CC DeVille situation where I think a lot of people back in the day probably criticized those players because of the bands they were in. And, if you didn't like the band, then you didn't like the player. It's like this whole Kirk Hammett thing, right? If anything, last week's Q&A proved that no one hates Metallica more than Metallica fans. And I think no one hates Motley Crue more than their fans these days. So yeah, on that kind of whole saga, you got to do something to make people want to talk about you, I guess, when you're at that stage of your career where you're a band that has had a farewell tour and you've said, oh, well, definitely never reform. Who's going to believe you anymore? So yeah, it's this kind of, empty, hollow theater about all of it. And with those kind of situations, I don't think anybody's actually ever going to know the truth. I don't think you should stop enjoying Motley Crue and their music if you really like it because of all of this. I can understand that it might leave a bad taste in some fans' mouth, and maybe you don't want to go and see them on the, the farewell tour times 10 when they've retired 9 times and they've come back 10 times and things like that. But, we're all just kind of suckers for this kind of stuff. And I guess it's entertainment in some way. I certainly knew about Motley Crue, and my friends knew about Motley Crue. They're probably one of the few hair metal bands that anybody knew about back in the day because of all the offstage stuff and, The Dirt. And The Dirt has now been turned into a movie. And, they, I guess, exist less as a musical entity and more as a pop culture entity these days. So yeah, I don't have any real kind of strong feelings or anything to add about a bunch of, rich rock stars squabbling amongst themselves. But, these things kind of happen, and I'm sure it will happen at some point with bands like Kiss as well, when Kiss inevitably move over to just Paul and Gene not performing live and it being a tribute act. So yeah, I really don't have that much more to say about it. But if you feel strongly about it, feel free to weigh in the comment section. My thoughts on Parkway Drive. Parkway were a band that when I first heard about them, I'd only really just started to hear about, metalcore and post-hardcore. And one of my friends, who I know is almost definitely watching this video, friend of the channel, Ben Wilson, I think came up with the best term to describe Parkway and the other bands around their scene at the time. And if anybody is familiar with the Australian soap Home and Away, Home and Away takes place in this little kind of surfy town called Summer Bay. So he dubbed them Summer Bay Hardcore. And that was just my impression of them, that they were just a bunch of dudes who liked to surf, who liked to write riffs and have breakdowns. And that was it. But the album they did, I think in 2014 or 2015 that came out, it's way more of just like kind of a hard rock album, and I really liked it. And I know some of the fans of the earlier music weren't as into that, but yeah, they've definitely kind of made that transition to like a mature hard rock band that can hold their own against some of the biggest bands in the world. I have another buddy whose band opened for them years ago, and he said he'd never seen a band sell so much merch. The amount of merch that they sold at their shows was just phenomenal, and the devotion of their fans to kind of own every piece of merch and every CD and every album was just something they had never really seen with a band before. And Jeff Ling in particular, the guitar player, I've watched a few videos with them. They just kind of seem like a typical Aussie bloke, really, really chilled out, seems to have his life in perspective, seems to be really, really humble. It's pretty admirable, I think. And if you watch any interview with Jeff, I mean, that was like half of my friends' dads growing up. They were these just kind of chilled out dudes. They would surf on the weekend. They probably worked a trade. They liked music. They just really were appreciative of the lives that they were able to live. So that's kind of the vibe that I get of Jeff. And Parkway, they're kind of one of the best bands at what they do. And there's those videos where I forget which guitar player had broken their leg, but they're just absolutely ripping on stage in a wheelchair. And that's pretty iconic to me. So yeah, a lot of respect for what they do. And the fact that they're Australian is even cooler. One last one for this week. I'm going to paraphrase this question, but if I had to be on a late night talk show and I was introduced, as an Australian, what would make me roll my eyes more? Hearing Waltzing Matilda, hearing Land Down Under, or hearing some In Excess? An American TV show, let's say that, because this definitely sounds like the sort of thing they would do. Waltzing Matilda, it's embedded in Australian pop culture. So I feel like someone might have done a slight amount of research with that one. It's like the unofficial Australian national anthem. So maybe that would be the middle one in there. Land Down Under is just, I love Men at Work and I love Colin Hay solo stuff in particular, but come on, that is way too cliche. So that one's probably going to get the biggest eye roll. And In Excess, I think it depends what they play, because there are some absolute banger In Excess deep cuts. And, when it comes to those spanky 80s guitar tones and amazing production, In Excess were amazing. Absolutely amazing. Like Suicide Blonde, the way the guitar sounds on that is just, I've wondered for so long how they got that tone and what they did in production. It's probably like a direct to board kind of thing with loads of bus compression or something like that. Maybe one of you can tell me about that, because there's so many wicked tones in there. So I'd be pretty happy if they did that. I think that would be a nice little fantasy dream sequence for me. On that note, thank you all so much for this week's questions. It was a great little Q&A. If you've got questions for next week, pop them in the comment section below. If you like what I'm doing on the channel, check the video description. You can support what I'm doing. You can get some free IRs. You can join my Discord. You can listen to my podcast. You can have a great week. I'll see you next Monday. Take it easy.